you guys?
What's up, you guys? Welcome to trèSci Weekly, episode 23. Today is Monday, July 10th, 2017. I'm one of your hosts, Jonathan Ullman, alongside the birthday boy, Tom Kea.
What's up, guys?
Happy birthday, my man.
And joining us,
special guest, salamander tattoo artist,
Alex
Novarro. Yeah. Woo. Welcome.
Welcome to the show.
Thanks for being here with us today, Alex.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah.
James says we got echo mode already in the chat.
Oh my gosh.
We got double mics. We got double mics. We thought this could happen.
So we did a little pre-test on the echo situation. We're gonna investigate on that. Don't fear. We can fix this by reducing it down to one mic, and
we should be good to go in a minute.
Let's see. Anybody else?
John's mic is a
second behind. Supposedly. Delay the other mic.
We're just gonna pull it. That's all you gotta do.
Always a few technical difficulties.
Always.
We're gonna pull. Oh, we should be good?
Okay.
Alright.
Cool.
So we're getting a lot of happy birthday to Tom in the chat. So
Yes,
thank
the
you guys
science
for that.
must go on, guys.
Yeah. Before we get into anything, let's just run through the quick spiel. Welcome to trèSci Weekly. This is our weekly video podcast talking about science news, trending topics in science, discoveries and policies and all sorts of that kind of stuff. If you have never watched the show before, you can catch us here on YouTube Live and chat with us during the show every Monday night at 8:30 p.m. Eastern Time. If you're watching this not live, if you're watching this on kind of the later version up on YouTube, we would ask that you kindly subscribe to the channel. That way you guys can get the email alert when we go live on the following Monday night. You can also support us by liking our Facebook page at facebook.com/trèSciWeekly. You can follow us on Twitter at twitter.com/trèSciWeekly. And if you're feeling extra generous, you can go to patreon.com/trèSciWeekly, where you can throw us a couple bones. That helps keep the stream going, allows us to buy dinner for our guests as they come and go. So that would be a huge contribution if you can swing it. If not, no worries. The videos are always free up on YouTube, no matter what.
Sweet.
With that said, thank you guys both for being here. I want to sort of turn to Alex first. I would love for you to introduce yourself to our audience. We've been chatting, of course, previously this evening and last night for a little bit. But yeah, share with us, if you don't mind, a little bit about yourself and a little bit about what you do.
Sure, and thanks for having me, guys.
Yeah.
So, I'll start with my title, I guess. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Maryland, so I'm going into my 5th and final year. Really excited about
nice.
that. But I like to call myself a conservation physiologist, so this is a pretty new field, conservation physiology. So I just want to give a little explanation of what that means. So basically, I study the ways that animal physiology reflects the environments around those animals. So how have they adapted to persist in local conditions? How do animals experience and survive in sometimes extreme conditions, sometimes really variable conditions, whatever it might be. But then to tie it to conservation, I look at how the individual physiology relates to population consequences, especially in response to emerging threats. So this could be like disease, climate change, or changes in the temperature in general. And so for my PhD research, I'm focusing in on a really unique family of salamanders. Salamanders are amphibians.
Okay.
So it's what we like to call cold-blooded, right, or an ectotherm. They conform to the temperatures around them. Whatever the environmental temperature is, that's what their body temperature is. Not like us. So these guys that I work with, called the plethodontids, they're lungless. So it makes them really unique. They're the only land-dwelling vertebrate on Earth that doesn't have lungs.
So how do they breathe?
Great question. So they breathe right through their skin.
Oh, okay.
So oxygen and other gases go across their skin. That means their skin is permeable and it has to stay wet. So they really depend on cool temperatures because like cooler water holds more oxygen, and also moist conditions because they need to stay wet to survive. So the group that I'm working with specifically, they're completely terrestrial. So they live in the woods. They're not in streams ever. They lay their eggs under rocks, in rotting logs. So they depend on the water, but they don't live in the water like other amphibians. Gotcha. So they really need that nice, wet, like montane forest habitat to survive. So my species, the eastern redback salamander, it's really wide-ranging. So it goes from Canada down to North Carolina. We're on Long Island right now. If you go out into the woods here, it's a little hot right now, but let's say in the fall you flip some rocks and logs, these are the salamanders you're going to find all over the place.
Oh, really?
Gotcha.
Okay.
Pretty much everywhere you go throughout their range, they're like super dense. So you find them everywhere. People are always like, oh, it's just another redback salamander, like in the salamander world.
Yeah.
But I love these guys because it poses a really interesting question for me of how, if they're so sensitive to climate, how do they live across this really wide range? They live at high elevations, low elevations, North Carolina, Canada, really different environments. So I'm looking at these guys to see what adaptations do they have that allow them to live across this huge range and seem to be really successful at it. They're in really dense populations. So I look at things like behavioral traits, physiological traits, and then I try to tie that to what's actually happening in the wild in populations. So you mentioned salamander tattoo artistry.
Yes.
So just to briefly explain that, when I do my field work, so I do the physiology in the lab, and then I do the population stuff in the wild, in the field. So I have a few study sites across, from the top of a mountain to the bottom of a mountain in southwestern Virginia, in the Blue Ridge Mountains. And so I go out at night in the dark, when salamanders like to come out and play, and I grab whichever ones are in my study plots. I have all the permits to do this, bring them back into the lab, and I give them what I like to call tattoos. So I inject a little piece of plastic below their skin, so it's subcutaneous. It doesn't affect their survivorship, their behavior, things like that, but it does stay for life. So if I go out and grab a salamander again, it'll have an individual code.
So you know that you've seen that one before.
Exactly, and I can track its growth. I can estimate survivorship.
Is it a QR code? You just take your cell phone and...
I wish. So with bigger animals, you can do pit tags like you would in a dog at the vet.
So
That's what they would put in. You scan it, it beeps. Salamander's a little too small to do that still. Technology's not up to par, and those are more expensive.
Yeah,
and with salamander populations, you get thousands of individuals. So what I do is shine a black light on them, and the tags fluoresce.
Cool.
Yeah. So, that's a little bit about what I do.
Awesome. So... most of that field work has been over the course of the past few years now. Mm-hmm. So, walk me through like what does a typical day consist of for you?
Oh, my days are atypical. So like a day when I'm in the fields, like over the summer maybe. Right. So I, for the past 3 summers, have lived at, not this summer, but 3 summers before, lived at Mountain Lake Biological Station. It's a field station owned by the University of Virginia. I go to University of Maryland, but you have people from all over the place at this field station. It's a great site for ecology.
Okay.
So it's up on a mountain. Say you're at Virginia Tech in Blacksburg. You just drive a little bit outside of the city and go up a mountain, and there's not much around, but there's this field station, and you're in national forest. Absolutely beautiful. So on a typical day, you wake up. We have a dining hall. They ring a bell for us for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, like a summer camp for adult nerds.
No way. That's awesome.
Yeah. But it's really cool. So all the biologists eat all the meals together. But in between those meals, my day starts at night. Right. So I'll start at the night hours. So it gets dark. Me and my field assistants never go out alone at night in the woods on top of a mountain with no cell phone service. Yeah. So me and my field crew will go out and. Until midnight, 2, 3 in the morning, whatever it takes, we go to whatever sites are scheduled. And so for me, that can be up and down this mountain. Grab all the salamanders in my plots, bring them back to the lab, go to sleep. Next day after breakfast, we process them all. And so what that means is we do like typical body measurements. We'll look for the markings, the tattoos. If they're not marked, we'll mark them because
Right.
it's a first capture. Things like that. Then we bring them back to their exact location. We mark the location in the plots at night with a bright pink popsicle stick that's numbered,
Okay.
so we know exactly where to put it back, because these guys live in they're really small, so they're like this big. They live in like a 1 meter squared
Sure, yeah.
area their entire life.
Really?
And we don't totally know the longevity, but they don't even start reproducing till they're 3 years old. So they actually live up into the teens. So they're a long-lived, slow-lived species.
I remember my friend had a salamander, and I remember it being alive for a really long period of time when I knew it.
You keep it cold, keep it wet, it's good to go. Yeah.
That's cool.
So is your route, a lot of hiking? Is it pretty, intensive? Like, would I be able to do it, or?
Yeah. I'm guessing you'd be able to do it. So.
But you need to be pretty fit, right, to be able to get up and down this mountain. I'm assuming.
Yeah,
right?
I always joke because during the year, then I'm back at the university. I teach classes. I teach undergraduate labs, and I do a lot of lab work, which means sitting on a bench and then staring at salamanders in the lab, not moving a whole lot. So I get into field shape very quickly.
Yeah.
So yeah, I planned all of my sites because it's in a well-protected national forest area. It's owned by a U.S. Forest Service.
Right.
You don't have to go too far to find really nice habitat, right? So I don't have to hike through a bunch of degraded habitat at my sites. It's like you get out of the car, it's beautiful. Yeah, no hacking. These are like beautiful old-growth forests for the most part.
Cool.
So for my studies, I plan to have it pretty close to the trails or the roads, but far enough away that people don't see my flagging and my plots and won't bother with it.
Yeah,
right, yeah.
But I have a few side projects where, we go out and we mark the location of the plots with just a GPS coordinate to get to it, because you don't want to put a ton of flagging tape and stuff up in the woods. It's ugly, and I don't know, it's bad for the hikers to see all that.
Right.
But we're out in the pitch black in the forest, right, searching just by GPS to find these plots, and some of those are, we'll hike in for like a mile, and there have been nights where it's just torrential, so the wetter the better also to find salamanders,
right.
So we go out in the storms.
Oh, man.
Yeah, so there are some nights when you're just drenched, like you can't even see in front of you. If my field assistants have glasses, you can't see anything. And those are the projects where, you need to be not only in shape, but like really want to be out there.
Yeah,
I love it.
Continue doing it.
Yeah, you don't just do that to do it. You do it because you love being out. You want to find these animals.
Yeah.
So from the chat, a few questions. Carrie asked, where are they located in the food chain, and like what eats them and what do they eat?
Mm-hmm. That's a good question. So they're really important in food webs and in forest ecosystems in general, especially in the northeastern United States. So they are insectivores. They only eat insects. The species that I study we did a study last year to see what they were eating, and they'll eat any insect that's small enough to fit in their mouth.
Huh.
Okay.
Not picky.
They're not picky. They're not picky, and they eat a lot of insects. So there are some studies that were done like back in the 70s that look at how they affect ecosystem services, because I said they're in really dense populations, so tons of them out there. So they're eating a lot of insects. So actually, if you removed all the salamanders, the ones that I studied, the redback salamanders, you remove these guys, and what you see is actually the leaf litter breaks down faster because they're eating the insects that would break down the leaf litter. So they're usually slowing down that process.
Wow.
So they're involved in carbon cycling. So you remove the salamanders, and you actually lose more carbon from the forests.
Huh.
In terms of what eats them, they're really efficient at digesting food and absorbing or assimilating protein. So I like to call them like the little protein bars of the forest.
Okay.
But, we don't know as much as we should about what eats them. Some studies say birds do, but remember, they're nocturnal. Most birds are nocturnal.
Okay.
But if you have some stragglers, so during the day they hide under rocks and logs or underground, but you always have some stragglers that are in leaf litter. So the idea is that some birds will see those and grab them and eat them. Now, some salamanders are toxic. They all have poison glands to some extent in their skin. The ones I study aren't necessarily toxic, but would probably taste pretty bitter, and they secrete slime as a defense.
And they have plastic tattoos.
Plastic tattoos. This bird just spit that out.
Yeah, the birds are they all the same gang? Like, should we leave them alone?
But snakes are a big predator. So like at my sites, there's a little tiny snake called the ringneck snake. And it eats the juveniles of the species that I study and their eggs as well. So that's the main predator. But in my opinion, from everything I've read and seen, predation isn't a huge issue for these guys.
Yeah.
Like you said, they do pretty well over a wide range of environments.
You spoke last night to me a little bit about this. I'd love for you to elaborate. But what other wildlife or predators do you stumble upon while you're on the field?
So down in the Blue Ridge Mountains, we do have timber rattlesnakes. So they're in pretty good decent numbers down there compared to how they're doing the rest of their range. So it's really actually only been one time when I'm out in the field at night, and I came very close to stepping on a rattlesnake, like one step away, and I was like, something on the ground, something doesn't look right about the ground, right? Like I just have a headlamp shining, it's a little too shiny, and it's just a rattlesnake hanging out right next to a log.
Wow.
Didn't rattle. The other ones I've encountered were just during the day, usually by a road, actually, because they're basking on in the warmer spot. But I've actually never seen a rattlesnake rattle at me in the wild. They usually just go about their business. So if anyone encounters a rattlesnake while hiking, just leave it alone. Don't get too close. Don't try to touch it. But just let it do its thing. It's not going to attack you by any means. They're still definitely victim of humans killing them because they think they're gonna hurt them, but they're just going about doing their business.
Not like those damn sharks in the ocean.
Don't say that. But the other thing I run into a lot, which is much less predictable, are the black bears.
Oh, okay.
So again, at night, right, we don't have nocturnal vision, so I'm depending on my headlamp. So when I see a bear, there's just two big white eyes staring at me. So if we see deer, their eyes glow orange or green, and they're small and kind of far apart. But so the bears, they glow white, and the two eyes are pretty close together looking right at you, and they'll often be looking at you and then get much higher because they stand up. So I've had a few trouble bears they're very interested in, we leave our scent in the woods, but also I put out like PVC piping to block, just to remember where my plots are, because I have to go back to that same spot. They love to pull the PVC apart. They love to eat really expensive temperature loggers. And some of them, I've seen some that I assume are adolescents, just are too curious about what we're doing. Normally what we do if we encounter them is yell at them, smash some sticks against trees, scare them away. And this is pretty typical for black bears. If you encounter them and they're a threat to you, if you can look bigger, look scary, that's good. If they don't run away, you should try to get out of there, but don't run.
Just slowly move away.
Yeah. So the scariest encounter we had, at one point I carried bear spray on my person, which I got from an REI store, so it was bought legally. But that stuff is powerful. I accidentally released it once inside of a field station. And people can't breathe when you release that indoors. It takes a while to clear out, so beware. But anyway, this one time we were on the Appalachian Trail, so really a heavily trafficked hiking trail, and it was right near some campsites. It's also the best salamander population that I had, so great spot, love it. But if people are hiking and they don't take care of their food properly, you're gonna get black bears pretty quickly. So we saw one, it wasn't going away. We turned, started walking out the way, like an alternative route, and we saw two more sets of eyes pop up. And so, like, knowing there's probably food in the area, these guys might be used to some people that have been here for a few days. I had the bear spray in my hand. I accidentally released it on the ground, because I keep it facing away from me. But I freaked out my field assistants a bit because they thought I was in a close encounter with a bear, and I just accidentally sprayed it. But we got out of there. We just turned and took a longer way out. But these are kind of the things that you end up dealing with in field biology. I never thought black bears would be so common for me to come across, but like I said, I think they were attracted to my stuff because it smelled weird, and they wanted to come check it out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's awesome. So one more question for me. I don't know if you have any further questions, Tom, but what I kind of wanted to finish with is what next, right? Like, so you've got your PhD coming to a close now with the salamander study. Will you continue to study salamanders, or are you looking to move into other work?
Yeah. So that's what I'm thinking about a lot right now. So the next step after PhD, I'm on an academic path, so I'd like to be a professor at a smaller school where I get to teach. I really love teaching and mentoring. But so in between PhD and professor, you generally have to do a postdoc or a postdoctoral position. So I'm looking into those. There's a number of ways to get funding for that, so I'm looking at all my options. But I'm actually interested in pursuing a new system. So I mentioned wildlife disease, so I really want to integrate my work in thermal ecology, so basically how animals and their physiology respond to the temperatures. Right. I want to integrate that with disease ecology. So there are a number of wildlife diseases popping up. We might talk about some today in one of the topics. But they're really bad in the reptiles and amphibians. So I'm going to stick with reptiles and amphibians, but I'm thinking of getting into snakes. So there's a new pathogen, or a pathogen that we now recognize as being common in the northeastern United States, is a snake fungal disease. So it's a fungus that attacks the skin of snakes. We're not sure at this point how it kills them, how often it kills them, how it affects their physiology. Right. There's some really cool systems that I'd like to work in with some specific species of snakes and get a better idea of what's going on and whether or not it's related to temperature, because fungal pathogens are really sensitive to temperature, just like the animals themselves are.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah.
Cool, good question.
Yeah. Anything else from your end, Tom?
I don't think so.
Cool.
As of now.
Anything in the chat?
James says, or 5 postdocs.
No.
Yeah. Awesome. So with that all said, let's say we get into the news a little bit.
Yeah, we got some good
environmental
stories.
Yeah, so we'll model. I modeled the show after some ecology stories so that we can get some great insight from Alex. And so we'll head on right into the news.
Sounds good.
So the first story, Tom and I on previous episodes, we've been talking a little bit about the bees drama, right?
Yeah,
bees.
And that seems to be something that most of your average person hears about. Do you hear people who don't talk a lot about science? Sometimes they'll bring up the bees because everybody sort of, I don't know whether they heard it in pop culture or here or wherever, but everybody knows that the bees are important for everybody. Everybody kind of knows that.
Yeah.
So whenever I talk to people, a lot of times they'll bring up a bee story.
Yeah.
Because it seems something that we can all relate to.
Yeah.
Everybody likes honey.
That's true.
Yeah, right?
So to continue the drama with the bees, here we go. Number 1, neonicotinoids, a widely used insecticide across the world, have been reevaluated by European scientists studying their effects on bees. Previous laboratory studies have indicated that even low dosages can cause bees to become disoriented, exhibiting uncoordinated movement and convulsions, and possibly leading to colony collapse.
It doesn't sound very good.
No, it does not. But critics of these findings claim the laboratory studies do not accurately depict the real-world application of neonicotinoids to crops, and that field studies are needed. Published in the journal Science, B.A. Woodcock et al. Report their 2-year field study assessing the effects of 2 neonicotinoid-based insecticides, clothianidin and thiamethoxam, on 3 different species of bees in 3 different countries. And the results, it seems, are split. After treating the seeds of oilseed rape with either clothianidin, thiamethoxam, or leaving them alone to act as a control, the researchers monitored bee populations throughout the flowering season, through the winter, and into the next spring. Quote,
so just before we move on to that,
sure.
As we're talking about monitoring the bee populations, that kind of sounds like a difficult task. You know what I'm saying?
So I imagine it's probably harder to do with the wild bee species that they're looking at, but probably the beekeepers that are dealing with the honeybees I would imagine they have a pretty good idea of like how many honeybees they've
Are in like their area.
that they introduced to these systems and that they're collecting honey from. But yeah, I mean, keeping track of bees is probably harder than keeping track of other species of animals. I'm sure they don't give them tattoos. But
Well, so
Yeah.
there's
You could
pros
mix it
and
inside
cons,
into that,
right,
yeah.
of every species you're working with. So this study had a great experimental design, and so what they actually did with their manipulation or their application of the pesticides, it sounds like they sprayed certain areas with whichever the treatment was, and then they introduced either the wild bees, the honeybees, or both. And I think they had 2 wild bee populations.
Yep.
So it sounds like they probably had it pretty well controlled. But the nice thing is you get a lot of numbers, right, with
Yeah.
bees,
Right.
and you don't. They didn't need to track individuals. So they were looking at like the status of the hive overall.
Exactly.
So each hive would be like an experimental unit, so you could get really nice replication that way. But yeah, I was immediately like, what? But what did they measure here?
Yeah.
Like,
And so they looked at hive survival, overwintering worker brood, and storage cell numbers. So I didn't actually get a chance to look that up, but I'm assuming it's the cells within each hive. But they mentioned that overwintering fitness has been well defined as a good measurement of how well these populations do overall. So
Right.
this is an example of a group of insects that are pretty well studied, which
Yeah.
is nice because then you have an idea of what really matters. So yeah, they had a great experimental design and put a ton of work into setting this up.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I guess within the hive, law of averages sort of plays a little bit of a part here, which is nice.
Yes.
So, continue on. Quote, for honeybees, we found both negative, and they reference Hungary and the United Kingdom as the 2 countries here. We found both negative and positive being Germany, effects during crop flowering. In Hungary, negative effects on honeybees associated with clothianidin persisted over winter and resulted in smaller colonies in the following spring, 24% declines. In wild bees, Bombus terrestris and Osmia bicornis, reproduction was negatively correlated with neonicotinoid residues, end quote.
So if we could break that down,
Sure.
what do we think the actual results are?
So it's tough to say, right? So they're finding that in Hungary, clothianidin is really devastating the bee populations. They're finding lots of trace amounts of that pesticide within the hives after the fact, after the winter. But then, somewhat mysteriously, in Germany, they're actually seeing positive effects. And in the United Kingdom, the numbers are so negligible that they can't even really report the statistics. So it's kind of just throw your hands up in the air, right? So I don't want to say that there's nothing conclusive about what they're finding with the pesticides, but they're not able to directly say this chemical is bad, right? That isn't really what's killing the bee populations, but what they're gonna basically say is that there's something larger at play here, that the insecticide chemical is affecting the environment at large, and that may be reducing the bee populations in more localized situations. So, and I don't know, Alex, if you wanted to comment on that or elaborate a little further.
I think the most conclusive result you get here is just that it must not be direct mortality from the pesticide, and that must be interacting with other factors. Now, they measured a lot of things here. Mm-hmm. I imagine they have some of those other factors, and they're probably analyzing that right now and doing that moving forward. But I do want to give them props. I said it was a good experimental design, but also we talk a lot as ecologists and conservation biologists about we're really critical of studies that look at one species or one population. So, this group really, they kind of had the dream set up. They did it across a number of countries in Europe. They had several species. It was a huge scale, a huge undertaking. And in the write-up right on Science Mag, it mentions the dollar amount, how much this thing costs.
I was just going to say, it costs a lot.
And that's why most people don't undertake
that extensive.
But so that being said, one of the things I thought was really odd about their hypotheses was this country-specific effect. And what I mean by that is, from a biological standpoint, it's not the countries that should be having
name
an
of the
effect.
country has no effect.
Yeah,
Right.
the bees don't care what territory they're in, but what about those countries did they think was having different outcomes? So that's where I assume they're going to go in the future. And I know they mentioned
wildflowers.
Yeah, they had something about how there was probably an interaction between the bees in different countries were actually using different foraging resources, which led to different exposure. So if they're eating different crops that have more or less of the pesticide, then they're actually not getting the same treatment across countries in this study. And then the incidence of disease within these hives. So colony collapse disorder, which I think you mentioned in the summary. So that's just a term that we've used in the past to describe the drama of the bees, or the declines. And there have been a number of hypotheses. One is pesticides, one is disease, right? So naturally, you could or should look at the interaction between those two.
Yeah.
But it makes for great science moving forward from here.
Yeah. So, just to finish up here, the authors of the study comment that the country-specific results may indicate that neonicotinoids play a more critical role in the grander scheme of regional environmental factors that are leading to bee population decline. Want to just comment that in the United States, the rusty patch bumblebee has seen its population plummet by over 90% in the past 20 years, and has recently been placed on the endangered species list. First bee to be placed on the endangered species list.
Yep.
And the EPA is now set to complete risk assessments for neonicotinoids next year, in 2018, after reopening the dockets to do so ahead of the 15-year cycle back in 2012, when they deemed it was necessary to reevaluate this class of pesticide. I want to throw up an image before we jump into a little bit more here. This is a graphic that was made by Compound Interest, a gentleman named Andy Brunning. He's on Patreon, so if you guys are supporting us on Patreon, go give a look and consider supporting Andy Brunning and Compound Interest on Patreon. Basically, he does these nice kind of clean graphics on different chemistry topics, and not just the chemistry, but how they kind of affect science that's in the news and just in general. And so this graphic I thought was really nice because it provides the molecular structure for the two neonicotinoids that we're talking about, as well as a third one here, I'm going to pronounce this incorrectly, but imidacloprid, which was actually found in trace amounts in some of the hives, even though that wasn't one of the pesticides that they were studying. This was widely used before the European moratorium or ban on that specific pesticide, and they're still finding trace amounts of it within the hives. So that goes to show you that even though we're not using it, it's still persisting in the environment somehow. And just there's some nice statistics here about when these pesticides were introduced in the 1980s. The number of countries that are now using them is 120, and they're now used more than any other pesticide in the world. They're kind of the most commonly used form of pesticide. And so if we're going to, deem it necessary to pull the plug on using this pesticide, that's going to really affect that industry. And I think that, careful studies are going to really need to progress us further in this topic. So, I'd like to just continue getting your thoughts on this, how it relates to our declining pollinator and bee population here in the United States, and what you guys think should be maybe the next steps for following up with this study.
Yeah, so a question I kind of wanted to throw your way was, how much do you work with understanding salamanders in terms of pesticides and things that we put out in the environment? Do you guys look carefully into those type of things?
So there's not as much in the salamander literature as there is in the frog, but frogs are like an iconic organism for studying pollution and pesticide use. So a big one, Tyrone Hayes, who is a very well-known professor at University of Berkeley, or University of California, Berkeley, he a while back did a ton of research on atrazine, which is in a pesticide.
Mm-hmm.
In frogs, it was very controversial. Encourage people to look up the whole topic. I don't want to get into all the nitty-gritty details, but in general, there are certain frog species, like let's say the wood frog, which is a pond breeding species that we have here in New York. It has a really wide range. They're like explosive breeders. They come out in the spring. You'll only hear them calling and breeding on a few nights when it's just really perfect. They seem to be really susceptible to pollution in general. So yeah, they've been one of those classic study organisms. In terms of salamanders, again, the pond breeding species we know much more about than the terrestrial species.
Mm-hmm.
It's a little bit easier to measure things like runoff, let's say in retention ponds. So let's say you go to a Walmart, there's usually a pond behind it because the water needs to run off the parking lot somewhere.
Right.
Usually the sewers can't handle that. There'll be retention ponds. Frogs use that. Big question is, well, frogs are using that. Does that make it viable habitat, or are they just do they come out with deformities from pollution? They do, especially leopard frogs, which again is a common species in the Northeast here. So is that just a sink that makes it look like, we have really great populations, when in fact they're not reproducing well, they're not surviving. So that's mostly how we've looked at it. I did pull up a study with wood frogs and the neonicotinoids, and it did look like there were sublethal effects. So it didn't kill them, but it caused some other physiological effects. Yeah, and that was a paper I think came out this past winter.
Yeah, so it seems like with the use of any pesticide in general, you're going to get some sort of impact.
Yeah.
There's no pesticide out there that you can just throw out there and say, this is good. This does the job without any effects.
Yeah, I mean, there might be. There's always trade-offs. Even when you're talking about medications, right? Some things can save your life, but will also have
little side effects.
Yeah, sometimes major side effects. You usually can't disrupt a system and just expect nothing else to happen. Like, there's a balance that's going to be thrown off, and you have to expect an equal and opposite reaction of some kind. So we're talking about this a little bit before, but we've gone through this pesticide, we were talking about it before the show, this pesticide story a number of times. And so an example jumps to mind was DDT, a pretty famous pesticide. So it came out in the 40s. We were all excited. This is a huge game changer.
Yeah.
Here on Long Island, it was sprayed over the whole island.
Get rid of these mosquitoes, man.
Yeah. And then we had Dr. Rachel Carson, who came out and realized, I think in her words, it was the birds were being silenced, or birds have gone silent, something like that. She wrote the book Silent Spring. That launched the environmental movement. It launched the creation of the EPA, and that happened in our own neck of the woods right here, is Cape Cod and Long Island.
Yeah.
So they first saw the effects of the pesticide in eagles, bald eagles. That it was thinning the eggshells, causing mortality of the hatchlings. And then they started looking into the effects on humans. So that's usually how these things go. You see an animal being affected. It's really easy to see it out in the wild, especially if you're already studying them. But the next question is, well, what is it doing to all the other animals? What is it doing to us? So that's what we tend to be most interested in. And so DDT is listed as a probable carcinogen, so it probably causes cancer. It's most often been studied in relation to breast cancer. Inconclusive results, but it's a real thing. There are some correlations there, and it is listed as probably a carcinogen. So it just kind of makes you think, like, at the very least, let's put the work in to understand what this is doing to animals and people.
Absolutely.
And like we said, the EPA is going to do follow-ups on these pesticides, and we talk all the time about people trying to cut EPA funding and how this stuff actually is very, very important.
Yeah.
Yeah, so, if the current administration gets its wish and the EPA loses, over 30% of its funding, that's going to, at the very least, delay the processes that these, people that work for the EPA have to go through in order to accurately do the research to come to some conclusion about whether or not these pesticides are affecting our pollinators or us or our
what
crops.
the trade-offs are. It needs to be further looked into. You can't just say this is where we're going to stop with these pesticides.
Right. So it's great that in 2012 we realized that this was probably something we should not wait for the full 15 years to reevaluate, that we should probably take a look at all of these things a bit sooner. But that was 2012, and we're still waiting for that to happen next year. So
and we talked about the price tag on the bee study. When you talk about studying this in humans, our price tag goes way up, and it's also just sometimes impossible to do. We don't mess with that kind of thing. We look at correlative data, and that could get really messy. So things like these bees make a really great system to get an understanding of what's going on. So support it.
Right. Unless you're James Farrell in the chat who says bees are evil, it's time we step up as a society and invent our own pollinators.
We actually did a story on trèSci quite a few weeks ago where they did a study of these little tiny mechanical bee things that they found could do some sort of pollinating. So someone's already working on it in case we do kill all the bees.
Replacing the bees. Replace the trees, replace the bees.
Right, the whole world is one nice small object.
All right, moving on. Number 2, oil spills may be more devastating to seabirds by affecting the amount of energy they expend during flight, a new study conducted by Ivan Maggini and colleagues suggests. To investigate, the team of researchers at the Advanced Facility for Avian Research at the University of Western Ontario used magnetic resonance scans to analyze the body fat of 24 western sandpipers. Next, they used crude oil from the Deepwater Horizon oil spill in 2010 to lightly coat the feathers of half the seabirds so that less than 20% of their body surface was considered lightly oiled. The sandpipers were then given the task of flying for an extended period of time, 2 hours, in a wind tunnel, and afterwards a subsequent body fat scan revealed that the oiled birds were forced to expend 22% more energy during flight than the birds who were not oiled.
So I just want to bring up a point that I was mentioning to you guys before, is that what allows birds to fly in the first place is because they're so light. That's what allows them to fly. And oil's a it's a viscous liquid that when you have it on you, it's like something that's going to stick to you, it's going to weigh you down. So if you're a bird who depends on your mobility from taking advantage of being light, I think it makes sense that if you're carrying this oil substance in your body, because your body weight is so light, that percentage of added weight is actually a big factor in causing disruption in how you move around. Right?
Absolutely.
Safe to say?
Yeah.
Yeah, and the birds that they use in this study are just to get an image of it, let's say you go to the beach, just any ocean beach, they're the little tiny birds that are running really fast up and down the shoreline. Yeah, they're tiny.
So furthermore, when the experiment was repeated but the sandpipers had additional oil on their back and breast feathers, and now we're talking around 30% body surface covered, the energy expenditure spiked to 45% higher than that of the oil-free birds. So now, just covering about 8% more of the body surface more than doubles the energy expenditure that these birds have to go through.
So I guess that would be like direct exposure to a larger spill then.
Right. So now, so I believe kind of the reason they did these two different body surface coverings of the oil is to simulate like a light spill, right? Like an oil spill that isn't necessarily as devastating as the Deepwater Horizon oil spill was, and then a more moderate sized oil spill for the second one. Quote, oiling tended to decrease flight control, and only half of moderately oiled birds completed the flight test. We then flew birds at a range of speeds to estimate basic kinematic parameters. At low speeds, light and moderately oiled birds had larger wing beat amplitudes than controls, while moderately oiled birds showed greater wing beat frequencies across all speeds, and a shift in optimal flight speed towards higher wind speeds. We suggest these changes reflect poorer lift production and increased drag on the wings and body, end quote.
So here they're getting into the actual physics behind the bird flying with oil on it and really getting into how it's affecting its ability to fly.
Exactly.
Yeah, so something I just wanted to mention, this is the type of paper I love because the methods are just so fun to think about. So they put the oil on these birds or not for the control, and then they put them in wind tunnels and
they just
had
watched them
fly.
fly.
Yeah.
And they compared it to baseline measurements that they took. So it sounds like a fun study to conduct, but the real key here is that they're taking the individuals again and hopefully ramping it up to the population level like we talked a little bit about earlier, and so they give some nice numbers in the end on how this actually affects like the layover times of migrations and things like that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so how their ability to fly becomes, you know what I'm trying to say, their ability to fly becomes compromised. How does that then affect their migration and the whole species in general?
Yeah, exactly. It
Yeah.
scales up.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll end on that point. The study also suggests that even small oil spills can have long-term consequences for seabirds who often fly great distances to reach mating locations. Being late to the party means that lightly oiled birds may not get a chance to mate and raise their young before the winter season arrives and the seabirds migrate again. And image credit for the images that we provided during that story go to Wikipedia, Alan D. Wilson, NaturePicsOnline.com, and Maggini et al., and the Journal of Experimental Biology. This is a nice study because it's pretty straightforward in terms of like their methods of how they conducted it, and as Tom was saying, I mean it makes logical sense, right? If you coat the wings of a bird with oil, it's not going to fly as well. So, it's nice to get the hard numbers on this because you can then extrapolate and see, well, and I didn't provide the numbers in my little write-up, but, they're talking that it could take these lightly oiled seabirds, I believe, up to 45 days, I think.
That was the high end, yeah.
Yeah.
It was like 9 to 45 days, I think.
Right, to go from...
like where they are in the
where they
environment
are
to
in their environment
to their
up
mating
to their
grounds,
mating- right?
Yeah.
Which is, I want to say, somewhere up in like Alaska territory.
It was,
for
yeah,
this particular species.
Gulf of Mexico up to like North Pacific, and yeah, up a little farther.
Yeah. So, our effects on the environment are, really far-reaching. Obviously, the Deepwater Horizon spill was an accident. Nobody wanted that to happen. But, I mean, that was in 2010, and those seabird populations are still suffering from it. So, it's tough to say, what can we do to really reduce our imprint on these environments, but still meet the needs of our own environment? This balance is really hard to manage here, especially with our population still increasing at a pretty high rate here. The need for oil is still quite high in demand. So,
so again, don't want to harp on this too much, but having things like the EPA in place, right? Those are the people who say to like the oil companies, they have them assess possible negative outcomes. Even nuclear power plants have this as well. Like they go through extensive just modeling, figuring out what's the worst possible scenario here. When we had this oil spill, I mean, I remember it being in the news. I was an environmental science major at the time.
Yeah.
It went on forever, and we just didn't know how to stop it.
Yeah.
And I don't know that no one person or company should be faulted for that. It's something hopefully we learn from, but it just I guess it brings that point that we really need to think a lot about what are all the possible things that could go wrong in the situation. Do we really have a handle on this? We're really doing a number on the environment. How well can we control it?
Yeah, I think it's really important for the agencies that deal with this, the EPA and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services, whatever it may be, to really make fail-safe plans. I mean, this is kind of a stretch, but NASA doesn't conduct experiments up on the International Space Station unless there is absolute certainty that nothing is going to go wrong, in a sense. And they've had pretty good success, as of lately, in ensuring that the livelihood of their astronauts and their machinery is pretty much well kept and intact. And something like this, I feel like, the design philosophy behind it maybe should have been looked at better before it
that's an interesting little thought experiment to think about the International Space Station, because it's such an isolated lab that if you wreck it, you destroy everything. So it's like a nice little nook look into the way to conduct research and to do things. But like we were saying before, we're trying to meet everybody's needs in society, and when a new drug comes along or a new way to get energy and oil, and once you implement it, it's a part of so many people's lives that it's just a part of the system. Even when you see these negative effects, like you said, you gotta find the balance.
Yeah, absolutely.
There was one sentence in here about the animals that I wanted to mention, because at first it seemed so obvious to me, and then I was like, that's kind of an interesting point. So they said, yet these birds possess few adaptive behavioral or physiological responses to recent, unpredictable, and rare events such as oil spills. So things I study, it's animals tend to have thousands of years to respond to temperature. They don't necessarily with rapid climate change. But, in general, there's time to adapt, to evolve. But with something like an oil spill, I mean, I hear people, even with also animals getting hit on the road, right? I've heard people say natural selection. But there's nothing to select for. I mean, you're just killing turtles that are crossing the road to go breed in a pond.
Yeah.
You're not going to select for them to recognize what a car is and that it's bad and be able to get to the pond, because the pond's still on the other side of the road. It's with this, you're probably not selecting for animals that are oil resistant. And if you are, that would mean that if there's another oil spill, it has to be in that same population. It's not likely. So
that would be like saying getting killed by a meteor strike is natural selection. It's but how do you prepare for something like that? So I don't know. All right, shall we move on? Number 3. Speaking of seabirds, emperor penguins, the world's largest penguin species, may also find their population numbers declining over the next century, largely due to sea ice conditions affected by climate change. In a 2013 study by Stephanie Jenouvrier, I think is how you would pronounce that. Jenouvrier. Stephanie Jenouvrier. Don't come after me, Stephanie. Stephanie Jenouvrier and colleagues, all 45 known emperor penguin colonies were projected into a migration model using data collected from point geology in Antarctica, as well as satellite imagery. Coupled with Antarctic sea ice condition models projected by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC, the global population of emperor penguins is expected to decline by at least 19% by the year 2100.
So they're using data from the ice, the amount of ice that's in the area, to then extrapolate to what's going to happen to the population of the penguins once that ice is gone and the change takes place, right?
Precisely. At the time of publication, the researchers comment that these projections are difficult to model since a wide range of uncertainties can exist by treating the individual penguin colonies as static entities. More recently, however, Jenouvrier et al. Follows up with a study incorporating dispersal processes of emperor penguins into their model. Quote, for emperor penguins relative to a scenario without dispersion, dispersal can either offset or accelerate climate-driven population declines. Dispersal may increase the global population by up to 31% or decrease it by 65% depending on the rate of emigration and distance individuals disperse. By developing simpler theoretical models, we demonstrate that the global population dynamic depends on the global landscape quality. In addition, the interaction among dispersal processes, dispersion rates, dispersal distance, and dispersal decisions that influence landscape occupancy impacts the global population dynamics, end quote. An image credit for our images go to Jenouvrier et al., Nature Climate Change, and Jan Will and iStockphoto. So
let's try and break down a little bit of what they were looking into.
Right. So their original publication, they're looking at this model here, and they're basically projecting out into the future that these emperor penguin colonies are going to have to move about as sea ice starts to diminish, and their projection actually showed that the populations might even increase for the next couple decades, but overall,
then it drops down.
It should drop down by something like 19%. To update this study, they incorporated now this dispersion idea. So that's incorporating how these emperor penguins are moving around within, colony to colony, I would imagine. And basically they're saying that depending on how versatile each emperor penguin is and how far each emperor penguin can travel in a given season maybe, and how acclimated an emperor penguin might be for moving from one colony to the next, they're able to either say that the global population might increase by 31% from that previous model, or it might actually decrease by 65% more. So there's still lots of uncertainty to this, but they're now adding a new component to their original model here.
So one of the big factors that contributes to that wide range there was, I think, that once the last remaining ice shelf disappears, you get that major drop off. But until that happens, you can still have an increase. I think this was a really cool use of modeling. So they used this term dispersal decisions. So it's actually assessing the individual's ability to recognize a change in the environment and move to a better environment.
To know that it needs to go there.
Yeah. So this spot's not good anymore. I got to go over to that spot and I'll be successful. You can't do that with most animals, so it's cool that they have the information to get to this level of modeling.
It's fascinating. I mean, you're basically measuring the instincts of an animal in a sense of wow, this is not going to work out for me for much longer, so we got to do something different here.
The point that I wanted to bring up, it seems to be extremely beneficial to have this much forecasting power in a biological system. So on trèSci, a lot of times we talk about forecasting what's going to happen in the future, and a lot of times in order to try and extrapolate further into time, they have these models that they put a lot of their data into that acts as their sort of test system. Mm-hmm. And we talk about it with weather and all kinds of different things. And what I wanted to ask you is, does modeling biological systems work out as well, do you think, as other fields, or is it harder? Mm-hmm. What goes along with trying to use models while studying biological creatures, basically?
Yeah, so I'm going to talk specifically about ecological modeling.
Okay.
So biological modeling, if you're looking at the cellular, molecular level, much more predictable in general. It's often under lab conditions as well. A little different once you get in situ, you see that out of the lab it gets more complex. But so in ecological modeling, we have a few major challenges. So one is we generally don't have the data or the understanding of the basic biology. So we know a lot about the big sexy animals. We know a lot about elephants, gorillas, pandas, a lot about pandas.
Emperor penguins.
Emperor penguins.
Yeah.
When you start looking at the majority of life on Earth, we know almost nothing about them. I mean, get into the tropics and it's there's still new species being discovered constantly. And I'm talking there's still new mammals being discovered every day. So it's just amazing what we don't know. And there is a trend towards reducing the funding for basic natural history knowledge, so it's going to get harder and harder. So the problem there is that you have to make a lot of assumptions in your ecological models.
Yeah.
As the assumptions pile up, the models become less realistic, so then you lose that predictive power. In this case, you have like a perfect situation where we know a ton about these animals. They're pretty isolated, right? They're in Antarctica.
Yep.
It's a tough thing to say, right?
Not much else going on there to interact. Of course, there are other things, especially, climate is the biggest thing, though, and that's what they're interested in here. So there's another example, like most of the basic theories we teach in introductory ecology are based off of very simple closed systems. So for example, like a lot of what we teach about predator-prey interactions comes from an island system. I think it's Lake Michigan, Isle Royale, where you have wolves that eat moose that eat a certain plant or a certain plant species.
And then you could just
That's
look at
it.
just that small little system.
Yep, and it's been monitored for decades. It's on an island, so not much goes in or out.
Yeah.
But then it gets really challenging when you want to apply that to the tropics, where you have tons of species eating each other, and you don't know who's eating who or what else is going on. And just one other thing I want to say about ecological modeling, I know this is a problem like climatology as well, we have more data now than we can process often. Mm-hmm. Many ecologists don't like math. I mean, I didn't really like math, and then realized I have to learn how to model, I have to learn how to code for statistics, and I do love applying it to my work, but it's a challenge, and every day there's a new method that's the better method that we have to learn. So things are getting better and better, and the predictive power is getting stronger, but it's a work in progress.
Yeah.
So I want to bring up one more thing about what you just mentioned with kind of building on assumptions. Now, I know some of your work is dealing with how salamanders respond to temperature change, and that correlates, goes hand in hand with climate change. And this study that we just mentioned, I mean, they say it right here that they're taking models projected by the IPCC, or the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Mm-hmm. Does that become challenging when climate change is such a hot topic for debate all of a sudden? I mean, how do you deal with something like that? Because, I mean, for somebody who just refutes that the climate is changing, that ultimately allows them to just invalidate any studies that branch off of those assumptions. Mm-hmm. So how do you deal with that a little bit?
Well, so first I'll just start by saying I've never had a scientist that I've spoken to refute it. So regardless of what you hear in the media, like, I've never been to a conference where anybody has stood up and said, like, your work is bogus because we don't believe in that. But also, so even if climate change, if someone doesn't believe it, I can approach my work in a number of ways, and I've designed it to do this. So I'm also just interested in how these animals have evolved to past climates, which I guess people could argue, but like, we have a pretty good idea of the past climate history in the United States, and also the current climate. So I'm looking at how they live in Maine and Virginia and seem to do fine in both. Mm-hmm. So most people around here, they know what Maine is like, they know what Virginia is like. So even if I don't get into that climate change aspect, I can generally strike some kind of understanding, something personal in them. But that's a great question, and in the past few months I've actually moved a little bit away when people ask what I do. Sometimes I'm a little worried even to say that I'm a scientist, so I have a number of things that I have pretty broad interests, but I could say professor of biology, or I want to be a professor of biology. So it gets tough with the social interactions with other people, but usually if I can relate with someone on a personal level, they tend not to argue too much, and they're more interested in just hearing about a cool species they might have seen as a 6-year-old in the woods. They get really excited about it.
Awesome. Yeah, I agree. I think that is generally what it takes, is just finding that personal connection, and then even if the viewpoints differ on that specific topic, like ultimately can move past that, I guess.
Yeah.
But yeah, Tom and I have had a number of tips on this show, actually, in the chat once or twice with the debate over climate change. So it's nice to hear that in the scientific community that's not really...
There's no real debate going on.
Yeah.
Well, and I'm all for debate. Yeah. But I mean, in ecology and conservation biology, there's also there's no argument that many things are declining.
Right.
We've also lost most of the habitat on Earth for animals. So in the remaining habitat, even if it's not climate change, if you go and log an area, you remove the trees, it gets hotter. You lose the canopy.
Happens,
So, I mean, there are a ton of applications here when you talk about thermal ecology. We do a lot to engineer our environments, which, I mean, it's pretty cool. We've done cool things as humans, sometimes bad for the environment, sometimes better for the environment, but, a lot of applications. We do a lot of things out there to mess with the environment, other than climate change.
Thank you for your insight on that. So I want to very quickly do the last story that we have. I'm just going to read through it because it's a quick one, and there's a couple cool videos that we can bring up for that. And while I'm reading through my little write-up for that, and we kind of talk about that for a second, if you guys in the chat have any questions for Alex that we can kind of close with, cue them up now. That way, we don't have to wait for the little time delay between us and when the chat goes. So cue up your questions now. I'll read off this last little story here, and then we'll leave you all for a while. Yeah. So the last story that I have written is about cockatoos. So male palm cockatoos use drumsticks, quote unquote drumsticks, made from sticks and sea pods to keep a steady rhythmic beat during a mating display, according to a recent study by Robert Heinsohn and colleagues.
So
and we have
if you want to get a meat, you can't just bang on something. You got to make a little tune out of it, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So we have a couple videos to show you guys. If you would mind bringing those up, Kyle, for us. This gets a little tricky now because we only have 2 earbuds. Typically, Tom and I will just share the earbuds here. I've already, listened to it, so I don't know if this will reach the 2 of you guys here. Probably not.
That's okay.
So I guess, Kyle, if you just want to bring it up.
We've seen it.
Yeah, we've seen it, so.
It is kind of fun to watch it again with the people, but we know.
Yeah.
We've seen it.
So it's going.
Nancy Cletus says, I could listen to Alex all night. It's wonderful. So you see him up there? A little metronome.
And that's just it, right? So it's not that other animals don't, make these kind of displays of
attraction,
music,
right?
or dancing or whatever it is for mating, but there is a steady rhythm here. And so the other video playing that.
If you've ever seen people who have more domesticated type birds in their house, you can see them sort of bob to music, or when you talk to them, they have a tempo to their bob. They get it. They get the rhythm. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, so rhythm might be more deeply ingrained than we thought.
He's listening to it there. You hear that?
So over 131 drumming sequences from 18 cockatoos were recorded by the researchers in the rainforest of northern Australia. The non-random spacing between drum hits is the closest example to humans of that kind of musicality. Quote, these discoveries provide a rare comparative perspective on the evolution of rhythmicity and instrumental music in our own species, and show that a preference for a regular beat can have other origins before being co-opted into group-based music and dance, end quote. And the video credit goes to Heinsohn et al. And Science Advances for those 2 videos. So I just thought that was pretty interesting. Cockatoos have this sort of innate ability to understand rhythm, which is fascinating to me because,
Because, what is rhythm?
It's
at the core of it. What is it?
It's something that's so ingrained in human culture that, we don't really think of it as, an evolutionary advantage anymore for ourselves. And so to see another species adopt that in terms of a mating practice must mean that there's something deeper to it, like you said, Alex.
Yeah, and it's just cool to think about some birds, like better drumming birds, get better mates, or I don't know. It's always interesting to make those. Try not to make that jump from this bird to humans, but you see some similarities.
Yeah.
Kayla in the chat says, I really like this episode, and she wished she had a good question to ask Alex. Maybe I could think of one for you.
Yeah.
So, on a closing note, one of the things I just wanted to say is, we were talking about it before the show, is that when you think about life on Earth and the history of all the life on Earth, and you really look at it, it's almost awe-inspiring how much we don't know and how much has come before us.
Mm-hmm.
And then when to look at the human race of where we are now in the sense of biology and in terms of the entire world, it's like it's amazing that so many people go throughout their day of going to a bank or a supermarket and this and that and just take for granted all of the biological history that came before them and how much we don't know about the stuff we're living with right now.
Yeah.
And if you just wanted to comment one or more two things.
Yeah, I guess just two quick comments. So E.O. Wilson, who's a very famous evolutionary biologist, ecologist from Harvard, he always has this comment about, like, we're spending so much money and trying so hard to find life elsewhere, yet we know so little about life on this planet right now. Like, the deep seas are still so unknown to us. There's still so much mystery here that we could be looking at, and microscopic species on the Earth that we live on every day.
Yeah.
So that's one thing to think about. The other thing I just want to touch on, you mentioned most people go through their daily lives not thinking about maybe the history, the natural history of where they are, but what it once was, what it is now. I grew up here on Long Island, like you guys. I don't think I saw a salamander until I was 20 years old.
Yeah, that's true.
I'm not one of those conservation biologists who has a story about being 4 years old and knowing, I want to work with salamanders forever. It took me a long time to figure out what I wanted to do. I ended up just kind of stumbling into environmental biology and went on a few field trips, and I was like, how is this all out here? And I've never seen it, and I didn't think about it. So it really totally changed the way that I view the world. So I just encourage everybody you could buy a field guide if you have kids or young relatives or something. Take them out in the woods. Like, nothing else gets kids more excited
than discovering something.
Yeah. Buy a cheap field guide on birds. Go out with some cheap binoculars or borrow some. Look for birds, and like, everyone's happy.
Yeah, good point.
It's great insight. So I want to say thank you, Alex, for coming on the show. This was really a treat for Tom and I because we just kind of babble back and forth like idiots to each other, and it's nice to really have somebody who knows what they're talking about on this show.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, because we like to talk about all topics, and a lot of times we go back to space and stuff because that's what we've done. But it's nice to look at these other topics that we could talk about, and then have you come in to talk with us about them.
Yeah,
that's great.
Yeah, so thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you guys for being here in the chat and watching live with us. And of course, join us next week for trèSci Weekly episode 24.
Great, thanks for watching, guys.